The chandeliers of the Grand Astoria ballroom dripped light, a crystalline rain of manufactured starlight that caught in the champagne flutes and glittered on the sequins of 1,000 gowns. The air, thick with the scent of lilies and expensive perfume, hummed with the curated murmur of the city's elite: architects, developers, critics, and philanthropists. The gods and patrons of the New York skyline mingled in a glittering battlefield of false smiles and calculated kindness. For Alara Vance, this was not a celebration. It was an arena. She stood near a marble pillar, a still point in the swirling galaxy of power. Her simple, midnight blue dress a stark contrast to the surrounding opulence. At 35, she possessed a composure that was often mistaken for coldness. It was, in fact, a fortress, built brick by painstaking brick over 15 years of navigating a world designed by and for men, like the one who now held court across the room. Marcus Thorne. His laughter was a deep, confident baritone that cut through the polite chatter, drawing people into his orbit like a gravitational force. He was handsome in a severe, chiseled way, his custom tuxedo fitting his broad shoulders perfectly, his silver-streaked hair lending him an air of distinguished authority. He was the head of Thorne Industries, a corporate behemoth that devoured smaller firms for breakfast. He built monuments to capital, sterile towers of glass and steel that won awards for their audacity, not their humanity. Alara built community centers, sustainable housing, and public library structures with a heartbeat. They were natural, ideological enemies. But their history was something far deeper, far more personal than professional rivalry. And the Visionary of the Year award. The MC's voice boomed from the stage. Goes to an architect whose work reminds us that buildings are not merely structures, but homes for the human spirit. For her revolutionary work on the Greenwood Community Project. Alara Vance. A wave of polite, yet surprised, applause rippled through the room. Alara's firm was small, a boutique agency that punched far above its weight. Winning this award was a coup, a career-defining moment that would catapult her into the industry's stratosphere. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, assessing, judging. She felt Marcus's eyes most of all. She pushed away from the pillar, her movements fluid and deliberate. The walk to the stage felt a mile long, each step a conscious effort to project a confidence she did not entirely feel. A massive screen behind the podium displayed a rotating gallery of her work children, reading in the sun-drenched library she'd designed. Families sharing a meal in the courtyard of her affordable housing complex. These were the images that fueled her. The proof that architecture could serve, not just dominate. As she reached the stage and shook the MC's hand, the images on the screen flickered. The rotation stopped. For a terrifying second. The screen went black, plunging the front of the ballroom into a disorienting shadow. A collective gasp, then nervous laughter, a technical glitch. But when the screen lit up again, it was not with an image of her work. It was a single, stark engineering diagram, a close-up of a structural support beam. A jagged crimson line highlighted a stress fracture, a fatal flaw manipulated to look catastrophic. It was a damning, terrifying image of failure. And then, below it, white text bloomed against the black background, stark and accusatory. Some mistakes can't be buried. The murmuring in the room died instantly. A thick, suffocating silence fell, broken only by the frantic whispers of the event staff into their headsets. Every eye was on the screen, then on Alara. They were seeing not just an allegation of professional failure, but a public execution. The air crackled with scandal. This was blood in the water, and the sharks were circling. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic bird trapped in a cage. The image. The words, they were a key, turning in a lock she had spent 15 years trying to seal shut. A memory. Sharp and cold. Pierced through her carefully constructed composure, the groan of twisting metal. The smell of wet concrete and dust. The chilling silence that followed the collapse. Bridgeway Tower. Before she could process the attack, a figure moved toward a secondary microphone on the floor. It was Marcus Thorne. He held up a hand, a gesture of calming authority, his expression a mask of grave concern. "My apologies for this interruption," he began, his voice resonating with practiced sincerity. The technicians were scrambling, but Marcus had seized the moment. He was the conductor of this disaster. This is a deeply unfortunate revelation. Truly. The integrity of our work is paramount. And while no one questions Ms. Vance's ambition, public safety must always be our first priority. It was a masterclass in veiled assassination. He hadn't accused her of anything directly, but he had planted the seed of doubt in the most fertile ground imaginable. He had turned her triumph into a trial. The word ambition hung in the air, a coded insult suggesting she was reckless, that she cut corners. He was framing himself as the industry statesman, the concerned elder, while simultaneously branding her as a danger. The screen finally went black again. The lights came up. Alara stood alone at the podium, the heavy crystal award feeling like a lead weight in her hands. The room was a sea of staring faces, a mixture of pity, morbid curiosity, and thinly veiled satisfaction. Her career was imploding in real time, and they all had a front row seat. But Alara Vance did not crumble. She took a slow, deliberate breath, the air tasting of ash, the terror, the rage, the crushing weight of the past. She gathered it all, compressed it into a tiny, dense point of energy deep within her, and locked it away. She had rehearsed this moment in 1,000 nightmares. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. She leaned into the microphone. Her voice, when it came, was unnervingly calm, clear, and steady. "Thank you," she said, her eyes sweeping the room before landing, with laser focus, on Marcus Thorne. "Thank you to the committee for this incredible honor. It is a testament to the belief that architecture should be about building communities, not just monuments." She paused, letting the silence stretch. As we've just been reminded, building anything of value requires a strong foundation, integrity, transparency, and an unwavering commitment to the truth are the materials I choose to build with. She held up the award, a serene smile gracing her lips. It was a terrifyingly controlled expression, a mask of pure steel. "I accept this award on behalf of my team, who share that commitment. Thank you." She did not rush off the stage. She walked, with perfect posture, back to her seat, leaving a wake of stunned silence. The audience, expecting tears or a panicked defense, was left with something far more unsettling: a woman who had just been publicly crucified and had refused to be the victim. They saw a woman who had been preparing for this exact kind of attack, making them wonder what deep, dark history existed between the industry's golden boy and its brilliant, besieged visionary. As she sat, Alara felt a tremor in her hands, the only betrayal of the storm raging inside her. She looked at Marcus, who met her gaze from across the room. His polite mask of concern was gone, replaced by a cold, triumphant glint in his eyes. This was not business. This was a promise. And he had just declared, in front of the entire world, that he intended to keep it. Alara's design studio was her sanctuary, an oasis of order and creativity in the heart of downtown. Unlike the cold, mahogany-scented arenas where Marcus Thorne brokered his deals, Her space was filled with the scent of fresh coffee and drafting paper. The warm feel of natural light filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows. And the quiet, focused energy of creation. Models of her projects filled every available surface: miniature parks, libraries, and shelters. Each one a testament to her philosophy that beauty and function should be accessible to all. The walls were lined with corkboard, pinned with sketches, fabric swatches, and photographs of the communities she served. It was a space that felt alive, a direct extension of her own disciplined, passionate mind. The morning after the gala, the sanctuary felt more like a bunker. The air was heavy with unspoken anxiety. Her small team of 6 young, brilliant architects tried to maintain a facade of normalcy, but their movements were stiff, their conversations unnaturally quiet. The attack had been precise, a missile aimed not just at Alara, but at the heart of their shared work. Chloe Russo, her oldest friend, sat opposite her at the large central drafting table, nursing a cup of black coffee, a veteran investigative journalist with a cynical wit and an unrelenting hunger for the truth. Chloe looked as though she hadn't slept. Her laptop was open, screen filled with a dozen tabs of news articles and social media feeds. "The fallout is contained. For now," Chloe said, her voice a low, rapid-fire staccato. "The gossip blogs are having a field day. Of course. Architect accused of flaw at awards gala. But the major outlets are holding back. No one has the source for that diagram. It's a ghost. Thorne's little performance was slick. He gets all the benefit of the accusation with none of the liability." "He timed it perfectly," Alara said, her voice flat. She was sketching on a pad, her hand moving with its usual precision, drawing the clean, confident lines of a cantilever beam. It was a reflex, an attempt to impose order on the chaos. Maximum humiliation, zero accountability. "This isn't just about the Greenwood project, is it?" Chloe asked, her journalist's instincts cutting through the professional jargon. The phrase on the screen, "Some mistakes can't be buried." That wasn't about a building. Alara. That was a message. Alara's pencil stopped. She stared down at the drawing. But she wasn't seeing it. She was seeing the Bridgeway Tower again. 15 years ago. She and Marcus had been junior architects at a large, soulless firm, both eager to make their mark. They were assigned to the Bridgeway project, a massive residential high-rise. They were young, ambitious, and, for a brief time, friends, or something like it. Then came the collapse. A section of the upper floors pancaked during construction. One fatality. A young man, a site visitor. The investigation that followed was a blur of corporate damage control, scapegoating, and sealed documents. Alara, who had raised concerns about the steel supplier, was quietly pushed out of the firm. Marcus, who had stayed silent, was promoted. The official report blamed a freak accident, a statistical anomaly. The case was closed. She had tried to bury it. She had started her own firm, dedicated herself to a new kind of architecture, one built on the very principles of integrity and safety that Bridgeway had mocked. But the nightmares never entirely went away. In them, she was always standing amidst the rubble, the air thick with dust. She was searching for something, a missing piece of paper, a crucial detail that was always just out of her grasp. "It was a long time ago," Alara said, her voice tight. Chloe's eyes softened. "Talk to me." "Elle, what aren't you telling me?" Before Alara could answer, the phone on her desk rang. It was Arthur Chen, her former professor and lifelong mentor, a legendary architect from a bygone era. Arthur spoke in wise, metaphorical terms, viewing buildings and people as interconnected structures. Alara. His voice was a warm, calming balm. I saw the news. A storm is not a judgment on the lighthouse. My dear, it is merely a test of its foundation. This feels like more than a storm. Arthur, she confessed, the first crack appearing in her ironclad composure. This feels targeted. Of course it is, he said simply. Men like Marcus Thorne do not build, they conquer. They see beauty and innovation as territory to be claimed, not as gifts to be shared. You are a threat to his worldview, and therefore, you must be demolished. He paused. But remember, the most elegant structures are often those designed to withstand the greatest stress. Your work has that elegance. Do you? His words steadied her. He was right. This was a test, a brutal, unfair test, but one she had to pass. The conversation was cut short by a chime from her assistant's desk. An email had just arrived. It was from the board of directors of Thorne Industries. The subject line was chillingly simple: offer of acquisition for Vance Designs. Chloe read it over Alara's shoulder, her breath hissing through her teeth. A hostile takeover. He's not just trying to discredit you. He's trying to erase you, buy your firm, absorb your projects, and bury your name under his. This was the inciting incident. The declaration of war she knew was coming. The gala had been the opening salvo, the public justification. Now came the invasion. Alara printed the offer. The paper warm from the machine. It wasn't a negotiation. It was an execution order, detailing the dissolution of her brand, the reassignment of her staff, and the transfer of all intellectual property, her life's work, summarized in 3 pages of sterile legal prose. He thinks he can break me, Alara said, her voice a low, dangerous whisper. She looked around her studio, at the models, the sketches, the faces of her young, hopeful team. This was more than a business. It was a promise. He thinks after all this time, I've forgotten how to fight. She picked up her pencil again. But this time, she wasn't designing a building. She was drawing a battle plan. The initial counteroffensive was a textbook case in corporate defense. Alara, guided by her lawyers and the sage advice of Arthur Chen, moved with calculated precision. She called her investors, her voice a steady beacon of reassurance against the storm of rumors. She met with the city council members who had championed her Greenwood project, presenting them with independent engineering reports that confirmed the building's structural integrity. She attempted to rally support from industry colleagues, appealing to their shared sense of professional ethics. It was like punching water. Marcus had been devastatingly thorough. Her primary investor, a man who had praised her vision just weeks before, suddenly grew evasive. It's the optics, Alara, he'd said over the phone, his voice slick with false regret. An accusation like that, it spooks the market. We need to see how this plays out. The line to his capital was severed. The city council, once her staunchest allies, were now fielding calls from concerned constituents, fueled by an anonymous but well-funded online smear campaign. Doctored photos and fake testimonials about her shoddy work were spreading like wildfire. Her political support evaporated overnight. Worst of all was the silence from her peers. Architects she had collaborated with, who had praised her work at conferences, now failed to return her calls. Marcus Thorne was too powerful, his influence too pervasive. To side with Alara was to make an enemy of a king. And no one had the courage for that kind of rebellion. She was an outcast, a pariah in the world she had helped to build. He's poisoning the well, Chloe said grimly, scrolling through a torrent of negative press during a late-night strategy session in Alara's studio. The city lights twinkled below, a glittering tapestry of the very world that was now trying to cast her out. He has everyone so scared of being associated with you that they're abandoning ship before it even starts taking on water. Alara stood before a large whiteboard, mapping out Marcus's corporate network. It was a dizzying web of subsidiaries, holding companies, and board memberships that extended into every corner of the city's power structure. "He's not just using his influence," she said, circling a name with a red marker. "He's weaponizing it. Every move I make, he's already there, blocking the path." The first obstacle had proven insurmountable. Conventional warfare was impossible against an enemy who owned the battlefield. A profound sense of hopelessness began to settle in her chest, cold and heavy. She was outmaneuvered, outfinanced, and utterly isolated. "Then we stop fighting on his battlefield," Chloe said, snapping her laptop shut with a decisive click. Her eyes glinted with the familiar fire of a journalist who just caught the scent of a story. "We change the game. We can't fight his company, so we fight the man." Alara turned from the whiteboard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we stop defending and start attacking. Not his business, his history, his secrets. You said this goes back 15 years. To Bridgeway Tower. Men like Marcus Thorne, men who build empires. They always leave bodies buried in the foundation. It's my job to find them." The idea was terrifying. It meant stepping out of the light of professional decorum and into the shadows of personal investigation. It meant dredging up a past she had desperately tried to forget. The nightmares, the missing piece of the puzzle, it was all waiting for her there, in the ruins of that old tragedy. "I can't," Alara whispered, the words tasting like failure. "If I go back there..." "You'll what? Face the ghost that's been haunting you for a decade and a half." Chloe's voice was sharp, but not unkind. "Elle, that ghost is already here. Marcus brought it to the gala. He's using it to destroy you. Your only move is to turn around and face it. Find out what really happened that day." Arthur, who had been quietly observing from a corner armchair, finally spoke. "A weak foundation can't support a grand vision." "Alara," he said, his voice a gentle rumble. "That's true for buildings and for people. Your foundation was shaken 15 years ago. You built a beautiful new structure on top of it. But the cracks were always there. Marcus is just exploiting them. Perhaps it is time to excavate and rebuild." His words, combined with Chloe's fierce resolve, solidified something in Alara's mind. They were right. Her defense had failed because it was based on the present, the key to her survival, and to any hope of justice, lay in the past. "All right," she said, her voice regaining its strength. "Let's go digging." Chloe grinned, a predator's smile. "Good. Where do we start?" Alara walked to her private office and unlocked a file cabinet in the corner, a cabinet she hadn't opened in years. She pulled out a single, dusty accordion file labeled simply Bridgeway. Inside was a collection of yellowing papers, her original employment contract, old project notes, and a handful of faded site photographs. "We start here," she said, laying the contents on the table. "We find out what really happened at the Bridgeway Tower." The investigation began as a painstaking archaeological dig into a forgotten past, while Alara's lawyers worked to delay the takeover bid. She and Chloe transformed the design studio into a war room. The corkboard walls, once covered in creative inspiration, were now pinned with timelines, corporate charts, and grainy photographs from 15 years ago. Chloe, with her journalist's toolkit of contacts and database subscriptions, began pulling public records, old building permits, inspection reports, corporate filings for the original developer. Most of it was a dead end, a labyrinth of shell corporations and redacted documents. "This whole project was designed to be a ghost," Chloe muttered, staring at a heavily blacked-out safety report. "The developer, a company called Apex Urban Development, dissolved a year after the collapse. It's a classic corporate shell game. They build, they profit, they vanish. Alara, meanwhile, focused on her own memories, trying to piece together the fragmented timeline. She unearthed her old project journals, their pages filled with notes on material specs and structural calculations. A recurring theme emerged: her persistent arguments with the project supervisor, a belligerent, old-school manager named Frank Henderson. "I remember Henderson," Ilara said, tapping a faded entry. "He was always pushing for faster, cheaper options. He overruled me on the steel supplier. I wanted to use Bethlehem Steel, the industry standard. He insisted on a smaller, less reputable company, Kestrel Metals, because they could deliver a week earlier and 10% cheaper." Kestrel Metals, Chloe typed furiously. "Let's see. Okay. Interesting. Kestrel filed for bankruptcy 6 months after the collapse. All their records were conveniently lost in a warehouse fire. How very original." The trail was cold, littered with corporate ghosts and dead ends. But they kept digging. Alara reached out to a few trusted former colleagues from that era. Most were too afraid to talk. But one, a retired draftsman, agreed to meet them for coffee. He was nervous, constantly glancing over his shoulder. Henderson was a bully. The draftsman, a man named George, whispered. He and the Apex executives. They ran that site like a personal fiefdom. Safety protocols were a suggestion. Anyone who pushed back, like you did. Alara got sidelined. He looked at her pointedly. "You were smart to get out." Marcus. He learned to play the game. Kept his head down. Did what Henderson told him. That's why he moved up so fast after you left. The comment stung, confirming a long-held suspicion that Marcus's rise had been built on his silence. While Chloe chased the paper trail, Ilara focused on Marcus himself. She studied his career, his projects, the public persona he had so carefully crafted. She visited his buildings, trying to understand the mind of her adversary. They were marvels of engineering, but they were cold, imposing structures. They lacked a human scale, a soul. It was the architecture of power, not of people. In a profile in an architectural magazine, she saw a photograph of him in his office. It was a sterile, minimalist space, all glass and chrome. But on his vast, empty desk, there was a single, small, silver-framed photograph. It was slightly out of focus in the magazine shot, but it was clearly a personal item in an otherwise impersonal space. It was a clue, a crack in his armor. The breakthrough came late one night. Chloe, using a deep web search engine and a source from her days as a crime reporter, managed to find a series of unredacted internal memos from the city's building inspection department, documents that had never made it into the official public file. "I've got something," Chloe said, her voice tense. She spun her laptop around. On the screen was a scanned memo from an inspector, dated 2 weeks before the collapse. It detailed a failed stress test on a batch of steel support beams delivered to the Bridgeway site. The memo recommended a full halt to construction pending further testing. The steel was faulty. Alara breathed, a cold dread washing over her. "I was right." "It gets worse," Chloe said. Scrolling down, here's the response from Frank Henderson. He claims the test was flawed. That a second. Internal test passed. And he threatens legal action against the city for the costly delays. The city inspector caved. He signed off, noting Henderson's objection. It was the smoking gun. The collapse wasn't an accident. It was a predictable outcome of corporate greed and negligence. But it still didn't fully explain the depth of Marcus's personal vendetta. Why resurrect this now? Why this obsessive, all-consuming need to destroy her? The final piece of the puzzle fell into place with a sickening thud, using the date of the collapse and the name of the project. Chloe had her contact run a search of hospital and coroner's records from that week. "Oh, Alara," Chloe said, her voice suddenly soft. All the journalistic cynicism gone. "Oh no." She pointed to a line on the screen. It was the fatality report from the Bridgeway Tower collapse. The official cause of death was blunt force trauma. The name of the victim: a 19-year-old college student who was on site visiting his older brother, was David Thorne. The name hit Alara like a physical blow. David, Marcus's bright, funny younger brother. He used to bring him to the site sometimes. Alara remembered a cheerful kid with an easy laugh who idolized Marcus. Suddenly, everything became terrifyingly clear. The cryptic message at the gala, the relentless, personal nature of the attacks, the takeover bid. This was never about business. It was never about a corporate rivalry. It was a vendetta. For 15 years, Marcus Thorne had carried the unbearable weight of his brother's death, and in the dark, twisted narrative of his grief, he had cast her as the villain. He believed she was responsible. He believed her ambition, her arguments with Henderson, her concerns about the steal, were all part of a professional recklessness that had gotten his brother killed. His goal was not to acquire her company. It was to methodically, painstakingly, and publicly demolish her life, just as he believed she had demolished his. He was seeking a particular kind of justice, a slow, torturous revenge for a tragedy that had hollowed out his soul. The fight was no longer about saving her firm. It was about surviving a man who was haunted by ghosts and determined to make her one of them. The revelation that David Thorne's death was the engine of Marcus's rage changed the emotional calculus of the conflict. Alara was no longer fighting a corporate shark. She was fighting a man consumed by a 15-year-old grief. But understanding his motive didn't make him any less dangerous. In fact, it made him more so. A man seeking profit can be reasoned with. A man seeking vengeance cannot. Marcus must have sensed her closing in on the truth, because his attacks escalated with a new, vicious intensity. He moved beyond professional sabotage and into personal destruction. An anonymous tip was sent to the city's Department of Buildings, claiming that Alara had bribed a safety inspector on the Greenwood project. An immediate investigation was launched, forcing a halt to all work on the site. Her name was dragged through the mud once more, this time with the stench of official corruption. Alara spent days in grueling depositions, her meticulously kept records her only defense against the fabricated evidence. Simultaneously, Chloe's editor received a call from a lawyer representing one of Thorne Industries' largest advertisers. The lawyer made a veiled threat if Chloe Russo continued her unfounded investigation into the Bridgeway Tower incident. The multi-million-dollar advertising contract would be pulled. Chloe was called into her editor's office and given a stark warning: drop the story, or face suspension. "He's trying to cut you off at the knees," Chloe fumed later that night, pacing Alara's studio. "He can't get to the truth, so he's trying to silence the person digging for it." "You have to stop, Chloe," Alara said, the weight of it all pressing down on her. "I can't let you risk your career for this." "The hell you can't," Chloe shot back, her eyes blazing. "He threatens my job because I'm getting close. That's not a warning. That's a roadmap. It tells me exactly where to dig next." Even Arthur was targeted. A whisper campaign began circulating among his university's board of trustees, suggesting that his long-standing mentorship of Alara was unprofessional and that he had used his influence to help her secure contracts. It was a disgusting, baseless attack on the reputation of a man with unimpeachable integrity, designed to isolate Alara from her last remaining pillar of support. She felt the walls closing in. Her project was stalled. Her reputation was in tatters. Her allies were under fire. And her firm was bleeding money, inching closer to insolvency with every passing day. The takeover offer from Marcus loomed, no longer a threat, but an inevitability. It was her lowest point, a suffocating darkness where every path forward seemed to lead to ruin. One evening, sitting alone in her silent studio, the city a cold, indifferent constellation outside her window, she almost gave in. The thought of surrender was a seductive whisper. Sign the papers. Let him have the company. Disappear. Start over somewhere else. Under a different name. The fight was too costly. The enemy too powerful. She pulled out the dusty Bridgeway file again, her fingers tracing the edges of the old documents. Her eyes fell on a site photograph. It showed a group of junior architects, herself included, standing with Frank Henderson. Standing next to her was a young, smiling Marcus Thorne, his arm slung around his brother, David. They all looked so young, so unaware of the tragedy that was about to unfold. Looking at that photo, at the ghost of the boy whose death had fueled a decade and a half of hatred, Alara's despair began to curdle into something harder, something sharper. Rage. Marcus had twisted his grief into a weapon and aimed it at her. He had allowed the real culprit, Henderson, and the corrupt system he represented, to escape justice. He had chosen the wrong enemy. She would not be his scapegoat. She would not be his sacrifice. The key had to be in the documents, in the one piece of evidence that connected the faulty steel directly to the decision-makers. She remembered the material approval forms. Henderson had demanded a final, signed approval for the Kestrel steel, a form he could use to cover himself. She remembered the fight, her refusal to sign, in the chaos of the aftermath. The form had disappeared into the mountain of paperwork, but she knew it had existed. "Chloe," she said, her voice hard as steel when she called her friend, "I need you to find Frank Henderson, and I need to find one more document, the final sign-off sheet for the Kestrel steel." Fueled by a new, cold fury, they renewed their search. Chloe, working off the grid, used a private investigator to track down Henderson. He was retired, living in a golf community in Florida, his comfortable life funded by his corporate career. The document was a harder challenge. It wasn't in any of the official files. It would have been one of the first things Henderson or the Apex lawyers buried. But Alara remembered the draftsman, George. He had been meticulous, almost pathologically so. He kept copies of everything. It took a week of convincing, but Alara finally persuaded him to search his personal archives. A garage filled with flat file cabinets of old blueprints and project files. Late on a Friday afternoon, George called. His voice was shaking. "I found it, Alara," he said. "A copy of the Kestrel approval form. I don't know why I kept it. I just did." Alara drove to his house immediately. He handed her the document. A single sheet of paper preserved in a plastic sleeve. It was the approval form for the substandard steel. At the bottom, in the space for the lead junior architect's signature, was a familiar, flowing script. Alara Vance. She stared at it, her blood running cold. It was her name, but it wasn't her signature. It was a forgery. A good one, but undeniably fake. The loop of the E was too round, the cross of the T too high. And beneath it, in the space for the supervising manager's countersignature, was the bold, aggressive scrawl of Frank Henderson. This was it, the missing piece, the key to the entire conspiracy. Henderson had forged her signature to push the cheap steel through, creating a paper trail that would lead directly to her if anything went wrong. But then, she saw something else. Something she almost missed. Stapled to the back of the form was a small, internal routing slip. It was a note from Henderson's assistant, dated the day after the form was signed. It read, Marcus T. Per your discussion with Frank, please see attached copy for your file. He appreciates you getting on board. Ilara's breath hitched. Per your discussion with Frank, he appreciates you getting on board. The implication was staggering. Marcus had seen this forged document 15 years ago. He knew Henderson had faked her signature. He knew she had been set up to take the fall. He had stayed silent, choosing his career over the truth. He had played the game. The entire narrative of his grief-fueled vendetta fractured. Was his rage truly directed at her, or was it a deflection? A way to transfer 15 years of his own guilt, the guilt of knowing the truth and doing nothing. The guilt of letting his ambition outweigh his integrity. The guilt of being complicit in the very system that led to his own brother's death, onto the one person who had tried to stop it. She now held the truth in her hands. It was a weapon more powerful than any corporate takeover. The final shareholder meeting to vote on the acquisition was scheduled for the following Monday. The arena was set, and this time, she was ready. The boardroom on the 50th floor of the Thorne Industries Tower was a cold, mahogany-scented cathedral of corporate power. A single, monolithic table, polished to a mirror shine, dominated the space. Seated around it were the 12 members of the board, a collection of the city's most influential figures, their faces impassive, their expressions unreadable. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, a kingdom Marcus Thorne believed he was born to rule. Ilara sat at one end of the table, flanked by her lawyer. She was a solitary island in a sea of hostile gray suits. Across from her, at the head of the table, sat Marcus. He looked serene, confident, the victor awaiting his coronation. The media was gathered in the lobby downstairs, a pack of wolves waiting for the outcome. The fate of her company, her career, and her name would be decided in this room, by a single vote. The meeting began with sterile formalities. Marcus's CEO presented the acquisition proposal, framing it as a prudent financial move to absorb a distressed asset. He used slides filled with charts and projections, painting Vance Designs as a firm crippled by the reputational damage caused by its founder's alleged incompetence. It was a slow, methodical dissection of her life's work. Then, Marcus himself spoke. His voice was calm, measured, filled with a somber gravitas. This is not a decision we take lightly, he began, his eyes sweeping the board before landing on Ilara. We all admire Ms. Vance's early work. Her passion is undeniable, but leadership requires more than passion. It requires an unwavering commitment to stability and safety. Recent events have raised serious questions. It takes a certain courage to move past old tragedies, but it takes wisdom to recognize when those tragedies are part of a pattern. It was the same tactic he'd used at the gala assassination by innuendo. He was portraying her as a liability, a risk his stable, powerful corporation could not afford. When he finished, all eyes turned to Ilara. The chairman, a stern-faced man named Blevins, nodded in her direction. Ms. Vance, you have the floor. The tension in the room was a physical presence. The air was still, the silence broken only by the faint hum of the building's climate control. Ilara felt a tremor in her hands, but she stilled it, drawing on the cold, hard fury that had sustained her for the past week. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, she said, her voice clear and steady. She stood, choosing not to hide behind the table. Mr. Thorne is correct about one thing. This is about an old tragedy, a tragedy that, for 15 years, has been buried under a lie. She didn't use a PowerPoint. She used a single file folder. From it, she produced her first exhibit, a copy of the city inspector's memo, the one warning of the faulty steel at the Bridgeway site. This is a city inspection report from the Bridgeway Tower project, dated 2 weeks before the fatal collapse. It clearly states that the steel beams from a company called Kestrel Metals failed a stress test and recommended a halt to construction. A murmur went through the room. Board members leaned forward, their masks of indifference cracking. This warning was ignored by the project supervisor, Frank Henderson. Alara continued, her voice gaining strength. He bullied the inspector into signing off. And the project continued. 2 weeks later, a 19-year-old boy named David Thorne was killed. At the mention of his brother's name, a flicker of raw emotion crossed Marcus's face, a crack in his marble facade. He hadn't expected this. The official narrative, the one Mr. Thorne has been subtly promoting, is that I, as a junior architect, was somehow responsible for this tragedy, Alara said. Her eyes locked on his. He has painted me as ambitious and reckless. But the truth is, I was the only one who fought Mr. Henderson's decision to use that substandard steel. She then produced her final, damning piece of evidence, the forged approval form. She placed a copy in front of each board member. This is the material approval form for the Kestrel steel. As you can see, it bears my name. The problem is, I never signed it. This signature is a forgery. She let the accusation hang in the air. The room was utterly silent. This was forged by Frank Henderson to cover his tracks, she stated, her voice ringing with the clarity of truth. He needed a scapegoat, and an outspoken young female architect was the perfect choice. Marcus's composure finally shattered. This is an outrageous and unsubstantiated allegation, he boomed, rising from his chair. A desperate attempt to deflect from your own failures. Is it? Alara replied, her voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. She held up the final piece of paper, the routing slip. Then, perhaps you can explain this. An internal memo, attached to the forged document, sent to you from Henderson's office. It reads, per your discussion with Frank, please see attached copy for your file. He appreciates you getting on board. She looked directly at Marcus, her gaze stripping away his lies, his power, his carefully constructed persona. You knew. Marcus, you knew the signature was a forgery. You knew Henderson was framing me. You stood by and said nothing because Henderson promised you a promotion. You built your career on a lie that you allowed to be buried with your own brother. The secondary twist landed like a bomb in the sterile boardroom. Marcus Thorne was not the righteous avenger he pretended to be. He was a compromised man, a silent accomplice whose grief was inextricably tangled with his own guilt. He had directed his rage at Alara for 15 years, not because he truly believed she was guilty, but perhaps because he couldn't bear to face his own complicity. Marcus stared at her, his face a mask of shock and horror. The truth, finally spoken aloud, had shattered his world. He looked around at his board, at the faces that were no longer impassive, but filled with shock and dawning suspicion. The vote, Chairman Blevins said, his voice a low growl. Let's have the vote. The tension was unbearable as the board secretary conducted the roll call. Each yeah was a vote to destroy her. Each nay was a vote to believe her. It went back and forth, the tally staying almost even. It all came down to a single swing voter, a quiet, older woman named Eleanor Vance, who rarely spoke at meetings. The secretary called her name. The room held its breath. Eleanor looked from Marcus's ashen face to Alara's unwavering gaze. My vote, she said, her voice firm, is nay. A collective exhale swept the room. The motion failed. 7-6. Alara had won. Her firm was safe. But as she looked at Marcus, who sank back into his chair, a broken man, she felt no triumph, only the profound, aching sadness of a victory that had cost far too much and exposed a tragedy far deeper than she had ever imagined. The aftermath of the shareholder meeting was a corporate earthquake. The story, fed by Chloe's meticulously sourced article, which she published the moment the vote was confirmed, exploded across the financial and local news. Frank Henderson was arrested in Florida. The district attorney's office reopened the investigation into the Bridgeway Tower collapse. The Thorne Industries Board, in a desperate act of damage control, demanded Marcus's immediate resignation. His empire, built on a foundation of lies, crumbled in a matter of days. In the wake of her victory, Alara was inundated with offers. Investors who had once shunned her now clamored to fund her firm. Competitors, smelling blood in the water, proposed mergers, suggesting she could absorb the remnants of Thorne's shattered company and create a new powerhouse. They all saw her as a conqueror, ready to claim the spoils of war. They had profoundly misunderstood her. She refused them all, taking over Thorne Industries, participating in the corporate bloodsport that Marcus had so loved, felt like a betrayal of everything she fought for. Her goal had been justice, not conquest, truth, not power. A week after the vote, she met with Marcus one last time. He had requested the meeting. They met not in a boardroom, but in a small, neutral coffee shop, far from the glare of the downtown towers. He looked smaller, diminished. The tailored suit hung on him differently, the aura of invincible authority gone, replaced by the heavy cloak of a man finally facing his ghosts. He didn't offer apologies or excuses. He just looked at her, his eyes filled with a hollow, 15-year-old pain. "I got the promotion," he said, his voice a raw whisper. 2 weeks after the funeral, Henderson told me I had a bright future if I knew how to be a team player. I told myself it was what I had to do, to build something, to make sure to make it mean something. And you told yourself I was the one to blame. Alara finished for him, her voice gentle, devoid of accusation, because it was easier than blaming yourself. He nodded, unable to meet her gaze. The guilt. It was easier to turn it into anger, into you. Every building I put up. I told myself I was making the world safer, stronger. I told myself I was honoring him, but I was just running from the truth. He finally looked at her. You didn't just save your company, Alara. You forced me to stop running. There was nothing more to say. She paid for the coffee and left him there, a man marooned in the wreckage of his own life, finally beginning the long, painful process of confronting his own complicity and grief. For Alara, this quiet, somber meeting provided the final, necessary closure. It wasn't about forgiveness. It was about understanding. It was the end of their story. With the battle over, Alara turned her focus toward a more meaningful form of justice. She sold a small percentage of her own company shares, which were now valued higher than ever, and used the capital not to expand, but to create. She worked with the city, acquiring the derelict plot of land where the Bridgeway Tower had once stood, a piece of property that had remained an undeveloped, weed-choked scar on the landscape for 15 years. She poured all her energy, all her creative spirit, into a new design. It wasn't a skyscraper or a monument to commerce. It was a low-rise building, open and full of light, surrounded by a public park. It was a structure that invited people in, rather than towering over them. The final scene of her long war with Marcus Thorne was not set in a boardroom or an awards hall. It was on a crisp autumn morning, under a brilliant blue sky, at a groundbreaking ceremony on that forgotten piece of land. A simple banner fluttered in the breeze, bearing the name of the new project: the David Thorne Memorial Institute for Ethical Architecture. Alara stood at a simple podium, speaking to a small crowd of students, community leaders, and journalists. Arthur and Chloe stood in the front row, their faces beaming with pride. She wasn't accepting an award or announcing a corporate victory. She was dedicating a legacy. "Architecture is an act of profound optimism," she said, her voice full of a warmth and confidence that was entirely new, entirely her own. "It is a belief in the future, but that belief must be built on a foundation of truth and accountability. For too long, our industry has been complicit in a culture that values profit over people, and silence over integrity." She gestured to the empty lot behind her. "A great tragedy occurred on this ground. A young life was lost, and a truth was buried. Today, we do more than break ground on a new building. We break a cycle. This institute will be a place for education, for advocacy, and for research, dedicated to ensuring that the tragedies of the past are never repeated. It will be a place where the next generation of architects learns that the most important thing we build is not with steel and glass, but with character." She picked up a silver shovel and walked to the ceremonial patch of dirt. As she drove the blade into the earth, the morning sun caught the metal, flashing brightly. It was not an act of burial, but of unearthing. She was not just winning, she was healing a wound. For herself, for the memory of a boy she barely knew, and for the soul of the profession she loved. She had transformed her pain into a purpose, her victory into a powerful, symbolic act of change. Her revenge was not in tearing Marcus down, but in building something better from the ruins he had left behind.